Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse, and today we are going to do another show on the book of Baruch. And today's topic is the Jewish reception of the book of Baruch. Just as with the book of Esdras, which is pointed out as some kind of problem when it comes to the North African councils, uh, we found out that actually the book of Esdras is a much bigger problem for those who want to appeal to ancient Judaism, as we saw with Josephus, who clearly said that he's turning the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and so he is using the Hebrew pretext of the book of Esdras and was translating it into Greek, so he clearly viewed the book of Esdras as scripture. And in a similar way, the book of Baruch, which is also pointed out by some that the North African councils probably did not include the book of Baruch. Ironically, the same way, the book of Baruch has an enormous attestation in Judaism. And again, this only reflects how ancient Judaism was different from later rabbinic Judaism. But we will see that even rabbinic Judaism developed, and the book of Baruch was retained for quite some while. And so in this episode, we are going to look at how the Jews viewed the book of Baruch, hence creating a problem actually for those again who want to appeal to ancient Judaism as some kind of 100% source that will align with the Protestant arguments. So in regards to contents, I'm going to speak about the Septuagint and the so-called Kagir recension, but we are going to also look at later Jewish translations and further on Christian Jewish dialogues. And finally, to spice up this presentation, I want to offer some responses to popular so-called contradictions in the book of Baruch. And for this response and for these comments, I'm going to utilize exclusively Jewish sources. And I'm going to show actually that there are no contradictions whatsoever. These are selected contradictions which were recently brought up, and I will show you that there really is no contradiction whatsoever in the book of Baruch. So first, let's look at the Septuagint and the Kagir recension. So, as I was speaking in the last two episodes, the Septuagint, of course, in the Christian era did include the book of Baruch, but not as the book of Baruch, but it was the book of Jeremiah. And this is very well attested in the earliest centuries of the Christendom. So that's why Hengel mentions figures like Tertullian, like Irenaeus, Athenagoras, and others who repeatedly cited passages from Baruch as coming from the prophet Jeremiah or coming from the book of Jeremiah. So this is a very important external evidence that the Septuagint, of course, which was inherited from the Jews, actually included the book of Baruch under the heading Jeremiah without any distinction or without any qualification between Jeremiah and the passages from Baruch. Moise Bogeat, who did a very good job on the book of Baruch, goes even further and examines how the last chapter of the Septuagintal version of Jeremiah is actually connected with the book of Baruch. So as I said, in the book of in the Septuagintal version of the book of Jeremiah, the order of the verses is different than in the Masoretic text. And of course, also the book of Jeremiah is a bit shorter, but there's a very clear connection between the Septuagintal version of Jeremiah and the book of Baruch. This is what Bogeat says. Additionally, there is a favorable circumstance. The Septuagint places the oracles concerning the nations in the middle of the book, and the oracle assuring Baruch's survival comes almost at the end of the book. Baruch thus appears as the notary and guarantor of Jeremiah's prophecies and their fulfillment. The narrative coherence of Baruch chapter 1 suggests that what follows is a consequence of the reading, not an antecedent. The penitential prayer is a reinterpretation using Jeremiah's text of Daniel's penitential prayer, which also follows the reading of Jeremiah's prophecy. The antithetical parallelism of the two readings takes on its full strength if they are the words of Jeremiah in both cases. So as you can see, Bogeat elaborates how the last passage from what we call the Septuagintal version of Jeremiah is actually connected to the book of Baruch, and it's basically representing one book of Jeremiah with a continuous flow of events without any break. Further, this is what we find in a book called Jeremiah Scriptures. While there has been some criticism of those criteria and argument for revision, his argument for Hebrew pretext or foliage of the Old Greek translation of Jeremiah that included Baruch chapters 1 to 3 is a cogent and has been broadly accepted. If we can assume a Hebrew compilation of Jeremiah already in the Greco-Roman period that resembles the Septuagint ordering, and that Baruch was indeed included in this sequence, then Jeremiah chapter 51 in the Septuagint served as a transitional chapter to connect the Jeremiah tradition to the natural successor of Jeremiah, Baruch. Baruch in his own book is thus implicitly writing as an extension of the Jeremiah legacy and would in fact be considered as such by many early traditions, at least in Christian circles. So again, we have an affirmation here that how Jeremiah chapter 51 in the Septuagint, which is the last chapter, is so closely connected and attached to Baruch chapter 1 that it forms one unity. So I think without a doubt, just as the Septuagintal additions to the book of Daniel were part of the book of Daniel, same way the book of Baruch was part of Jeremiah in the Septuagint, which of course predates the turn of the era. But we have also another Greek text, which is the Kyger recension. And I tried to use really up-to-date articles and scholarly works for this presentation. So Timothy Lee, I think, describes the Kyger recension very, very well in his article. Kyger is a textual layer in which the Old Greek Septuagint was revised to accurately match the Proto-Masoretic text at a lexeme level. Further on, he says, it moves away from the occasionally free translations in the Old Greek texts towards a stronger isomorphic approach that matches the Hebrew word order and standardizes translation equivalence. So what Timothy Lee is saying that the Septuagint was a bit of paraphrastic translation of the Hebrew text. However, the goal of the Kaige revision or recension was to bring the Greek more in line with the Hebrew. So it tried to represent an interlineal translation, a word-to-word translation, so it can match the Proto-Masoretic text, which is basically the text from which the Masoretic text emerged or developed, and which was used by the rabbinical Judaism. Further, we have other scholars confirming that this translation began appearing in the 1st century BCE, so before the turn of the era, and it seems to have originated in Palestine. Now, of course, this is natural and reasonable argument, because where would the Jews try to match, the Greek text with the Hebrew original? Of course, it would be in Palestine, where they try to adopt the Greek and bring it more in line with the Hebrew Proto-Masoretic text. First of these texts were found in the so-called Nahal Hevel scrolls, and it was anticipated that these scrolls had something to do with the later translations, which were of Aquila and Theodotion, and all these translations, like the Kegi and the translation of Aquila and Theodotion, were aimed to replace the paraphrastic translation of the Septuagint. Here we have Jan Houston in 2018 writing this article, who says, Aquila around the year 120 based his more thorough revision of the Septuagint on the work of the Kaige group. Most knowledgeable scholars agree that the Greek Minor Prophet scroll from Nahal Havea are closely related also to Theodotion and to Aquila. Sometimes you can see the phrase Kaige Theodotion, like in this instance. It says, Kaige Theodotion and Aquila represent successive stages in a textual process whereby the Septuagint was brought into line with the Proto-Masoretic text, a text which was emerging as a textual standard in Palestinian Judaism. That's right. The Proto-Masoretic text was circulating in Palestine, and so the Kaige recension, of course, would emerge in Palestine, since the aim of the Kaige recension and of these later translators was to bring the Greek more in line with the Proto-Masoretic text. So Houston summarizes, as to location, our new evidence strongly confirms Thackeray's and Barthelme's notion that the Kaige group must have been active in Palestine. Now, of course, earlier scholars like Sundberg would suggest that it emerged in Alexandria, but there really isn't any good evidence for its development in Alexandria, but rather in Palestine. So here we have also Emmanuel Tow, who says the Kaige Theodotion revision contained at least Baruch and the expanded version of Daniel, in addition to the canonical books of the Bible. And Emmanuel Tow also confirms that the Kaige translation or revision appeared first in the middle of the 1st century BCE, so before the turn of the era. And here's Sundberg. who says the Kagi recension at the end of the 1st century BC revised the Greek Bible to accord with the Proto-Rabbinic text, which is the Proto-Masoretic text. Recensions extended to the book of Baruch and the longer edition of Daniel. Since the recension labors in the Kagi recension can be dated to about the turn of the Common Era and its Pharisaic basis is clear, it follows that as late as the end of the 1st century BC, an authoritative canonical list had not yet emerged, at least in its final form, even in Pharisaic circles. So Sundberg argues that since the Kagi recension, which tried to bring the Greek more in line with the Proto-Rabbinic text, still included Baruch and the additions to Daniel. Therefore, we cannot talk about a closed textual canon even in Pharisaic circles. Here we have John Mead, who says that the Kagi included the more well-known reviser, Theodotion, and probably peaked and was perfected in the work of Aquila. Both of these revisions represent very literal translations and even stereotypical equivalents in the case of Aquila. Now, an exception was Symmachus. Later, Symmachus rendered the Hebrew more functionally and generally avoided the approaches introduced by Kagi. Actually, Jerome liked Symmachus because Symmachus was more paraphrastic, while Theodotion and Aquila were very stereotypical translators. And as you can see, Dr. Mead argues that both Theodotion and Aquila made use of the Kagi, and they perfected it. And this brings me to the question, well, if the Kagi recension included the book of Baruch, and Aquila and Theodotion actually used this revision, did they actually include the book of Baruch as well? So let's look at these later Jewish Greek translations. And these are the translations of Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. But as I said, those who actually perfected the Kagi revision were only Aquila and Theodotion. So I'm going to look into these two. But first, who were these three, the translators, Aquila, Theodotion, and Symmachus? So in the Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics, this is how they describe these translators. All three are clearly Jewish translations that display numerous links with rabbinic interpretations of scripture, with Aquila being quoted on numerous occasions in both Talmuds. Both rabbinic and patristic sources state that Aquila was a proselyte. It appears that there are two probable reasons behind their inception. So there are two reasons why they made a new Greek translation of the scriptures. The adoption of the Septuagint by the Christian Church and or the desire to correct the Septuagint by bringing it closer in line with the Hebrew. This later reason is particularly relevant for Aquila and Theodotion, who are very literal in their renderings of the Hebrew. Aquila took the literal approach to the extreme, possibly influenced by the teaching of Rabbi Akiva. So it seems that there are two motivations for these new translations made by Aquila and Theodotion and possibly Symmachus in the 2nd century, and that is because the Christians used the Septuagint, so they wanted to create a new Greek translation which would be disseminated. And of course, these, as the text says, these were proselytes, So they wanted to use the text in order to bring back the Christians to Judaism. So the tool of this translation was proselytism, and they wanted at the same time they wanted to bring the Greek closer to the Hebrew. So what we will expect is that the translations, the scriptures that Theodotion and Aquila translated are, of course, from the Hebrew, and therefore it should match the Masoretic text, right? Since they are basically working in rabbinic circles and Pharisaic circles. Therefore, one would expect that their translation would purely reflect the Masoretic text without any other books included in them, especially if they were proselytes. But what was very striking for me is when I was researching about these translators, first I noticed that this Protestant scholar says this: Theodosian's version included all the canonical books of the Old Testament except probably Lamentations. Of the apocryphal books, he is only known to have included Baruch and the additions to Daniel. So Henry Weiss, who is a Protestant scholar, argues that Theodosian's version actually included not only additions to Daniel, which we are aware of, but even the book of Baruch. Now, this is quite striking because, as I said, if they are really trying to bring the Greek closer to the Hebrew and they're translating the Proto-Masoretic text, then if the argument is that the original Hebrew text didn't include any of these deuterocanonical books, then suddenly why is Theodosian including Baruch and the additions of Daniel in his translation? And this wasn't only the only source I found. There was also another source in the New Catholic Commentary on the Holy Scriptures by Fuller. And there is this passage. Eisfeld is also the opinion that the poems in Baruch chapter 3 and 5 were originally composed in Hebrew. Again, the directive of chapter 1 verse 14 indicates liturgical use and argues to a Hebrew original. The Greek translation too would indicate dependence on the Greek version of Jeremiah, and Daniel Theodosian's version made from Hebrew includes Baruch. Very interesting. So again, another secondary source which says that Theodosian also included the book of Baruch. Now, as I went on researching, I even found the same thing in Dr. Gallagher's and Dr. Mead's book, The Biblical Canon List from Early Christianity. And they not only say that Theodosian included Baruch, but also Aquila. So this is what Gallagher and Mead says. As for the later Greek translations, the three, there are 6 Theodosian fragments of Baruch and 1 fragment attributed to Aquila. In the textual history of the Bible, and this is what one can read when you look up the chapter about the book of Baruch. According to Ziegler's apparatus, there are several readings designated as Theodosian in the Syro-Hexapla as well as in the margins of the Septuagint manuscript number 86. And there is one instance marked as Aquila in this manuscript. It is thus possible that both Theodosian and Aquila included Baruch. I mean, wow. So both, not only Theodosian, but also Aquila included the book of Baruch. Now, I was asking the question to myself, what is this Ziegler's apparatus? So Ziegler is an author who made the best critical edition of the Greek texts. As Michael Tony asserts, the most fully critical edition based on all available textual evidence before the age of printing is that of Ziegler. So I went on and looked at Joseph Ziegler's critical edition of the Greek texts. And indeed, as you can see here, it's written in German. He affirms that we have in this manuscript 86 in the apparatus note that Baruch chapter 2 verse 11 includes a variant from Theodotion, and in chapter 2 verse 13 there is a variant reading from Aquila. I also looked up the manuscript itself, manuscript number 86. And further, I looked up all these textual variants from the book of Baruch, which are attributed to Theodotion and Aquila, and I found all of them. So, as you can see here, this is Aquila's reading, and this is Theodotion's reading. And so here are the various variations from Theodotion marked with a green line. So they are from chapter 1 verse 1, chapter 2 verse 2, chapter 11, chapter 29, and chapter 4. And also there's a variant from Aquila in Baruch chapter 11 verse chapter 13. What is interesting that this means that the compiler or the author of these manuscripts actually had the translation of Aquila and Theodotion, so they were able to mark in this ancient manuscript that this passage from Baruch, or this word, is actually translated otherwise in Aquilian Theodotion. So they are trying to say that Aquila and Theodotion are using different words in the book of Baruch. But this then means that actually Theodotion and Aquila included the book of Baruch into their own translations. And of course, this is quite a problem, because why would these translators include the book of Baruch if they did not regard it as sacred scripture? They weren't just ordinary Jews, they were proselytes, right? Especially if the Christians were using the book of Baruch for confirming the deity of Christ, and we know that they used Baruch a lot. It doesn't really make sense including the book of Baruch in their Bible if they didn't regard it as sacred scriptures. That would just undermine their position. The only reasonable explanation is that Aquila and Theodotion in the 2nd century reflect that the Jews, the emerging rabbinical Judaism, still included the book of Baruch among their sacred scriptures, and probably as part of Jeremiah. Since there wasn't a book of Baruch in the 2nd century, it was still Jeremiah. And this is what this scholarly book says. These variants suggest, in any case, that until the end of the 1st century BCE, Baruch was part of a rabbinic tradition that had not yet established in its definitive form an authoritative list. It is likely that Baruch, like the letter of Jeremiah, originally existed as independent books, which were early on associated by Jews with the book of Jeremiah. So yes, these were written as separate books, but very early on, even before the turn of the era, were part or became part of the book of Jeremiah in rabbinical circles. And again, however, the existence of manuscript variants attributed to Theodotion for the Greek text of Baruch may perhaps testify to the existence of an original Hebrew text from which the Greek text could have been revised. And further on in the book, you can see it's not only the Syro-Hexapla and the manuscript 86, which is Codex Barbarinus, which includes these variants or variant readings by Theodotion from the Book of Baruch, but there are also other manuscripts as well. So it seems to be confirming that really Theodotion and Aquila clearly included the Book of Baruch in their Bible. Furthermore, if we look at the testimony of the Church Fathers, they repeatedly say that the Jews actually include the Book of Baruch, right? So when we look at Origen, as I said, Origen does not say in his list that it's Baruch. He only says epistle or letter. And as I said, this is quite ambiguous because the Book of Baruch was also called an epistle or letter many times. So we see this in, for example, I think it was Epiphanius, I'm not sure now. But we see these also in some apostolic churches. And so, yes, we cannot really rule out that even Origen was aware that the Book of Baruch was part of Jeremiah among the Hebrews, right? His list certainly doesn't match the modern Hebrew canon because he includes the letter, right? The epistle. So that does make a difference. And as I said, since these second century translators like Aquila and Theodotion included the Book of Baruch, it's highly probable that Melito of Sardis, when traveling to east, presumably to Jerusalem, to to ask the Jews or to research from Jewish sources what their canon is, it's quite possible that Melito would subsume the Book of Baruch under the heading Jeremiah. So Melito is not saying that they have the Book of Baruch. He's not even citing the Book of Baruch. But in the second century, there was no Book of Baruch. There was only Jeremiah. So we cannot really rule out the possibility that Melito of Sardis' list would also include the Book of Baruch under the heading Jeremiah. And if this is the case, then virtually we don't find any church father ultimately rejecting Baruch, because even Jerome originally accepted it, right? And Cyril of Jerusalem and Athanasius explicitly state that the Hebrews do include the Book of Baruch, right? So for Cyril, it's part of Jeremiah, and Athanasius says it's canonical and it's part of Jeremiah, and both at the same time mention what the Hebrews handed down. So that's another confirmation that there was a recognition that the Jews, at least for a certain period, even after the second century, would have included the Book of Baruch in their sacred scriptures. Now let's move on in time and let's look at some Christian-Jewish dialogues, which would also reflect what the Christians believed to be the Jewish sacred scriptures, or at least part of it. So what are these dialogues? These are coming from the 4th, 5th century. Some scholars argued that these do not reflect a genuine Jewish-Christian debate, but only served as sort of catechetical manual. On the other hand, um, Arthur Marmenstein argued that Simon did accurately articulate Jewish views similar to those expressed by certain second century rabbis. So, you know, there wasn't really a consensus in the beginning whether these Jewish Christian dialogues are actually reflecting a genuine dialogue which actually took place in the 4th or 5th century. But on the other hand, we have really many other scholars who say that these dialogues do represent, at least from a Christian perspective, the Jewish biblical interpretation of the era and is not an inaccurate reflection of real Jewish Christian debate at the time. So you can read it for yourself. These are some informations about these Jewish Christian dialogues, but ultimately, here's the conclusion. In conclusion, perhaps a qualified response of yes to the question should include the fact that the dialogues such as Trypho and Timothy and Aquila are sandwiched within the larger narrative framework and include many personal touches in them. So ultimately it seems that these dialogues are true and are reflecting at least partially real Christian Jewish dialogues which took place in the 4th, 5th, and the 6th century. Now let's look at these dialogues. Now initially I found only some where the Jews were rejecting the book of Baruch, but surprisingly there are also some dialogues where the Jew is actually affirming the book of Baruch as sacred scripture. So here's, for example, the dialogue between Athanasius and Zacchaeus, where Zacchaeus is the Jew and Athanasius is the Christian. So Zacchaeus said, "Let us grant that both God and the wisdom are one, but surely she," meaning wisdom, "is not also the Messiah born from a woman?" Athanasius said, "The same wisdom being only and truly God from God, because men were perishing, willed to appear on earth and to live with man." So he's quoting the book of Baruch, the famous chapter 3, verse 38. And again, Zacchaeus said, "And the wisdom of God, was he seen upon earth?" Athanasius said, "And why should be this strange?" Here Jeremiah speaking. So notice, it's not Baruch speaking, it's Jeremiah speaking. Here Jeremiah speaking, "This is our God, no other can be compared to him. He found the whole way to knowledge. Afterward he appeared upon earth and lived among men." So he's quoting Baruch. Zacchaeus said, "That was not written in Jeremiah." Athanasius said, "Read the epistle of Baruch, so that you will know and believe that it was so written." Zacchaeus said, "I know that it is written in that epistle, but it was not written in Jeremiah." Athanasius, "Jeremiah along with Baruch and the Lamentations and the epistle are written in one book, and the 4 of these books are named Jeremiah." So notice, first, the Christian is citing Baruch as coming from Jeremiah, confirming what we were talking about in previous 2 presentations. Further, he says this is the epistle of Baruch. Again, so you can see Baruch was also used as an epistle. It's not really a book, but an epistle. So when Origen says that the Hebrews handed down also the epistle, it can quite easily be also the epistle of Baruch. And further, notice that Athanasius says that all these parts of Jeremiah, like Jeremiah, Baruch, Lamentations, and the epistle of Jeremiah, are comprising one book which is called Jeremiah. So he's reflecting how the early church viewed the book of Baruch. Now let's go on to Simon and Theophilus. Certainly it was God and Father speaking of Christ, his own Son, for whom and about whom Jeremiah, that most esteemed of prophets, speaks. And again, he goes on quoting the book of Baruch as coming from the prophet Jeremiah. Timothy and Aquila. By the Spirit of the Lord Christ before our face, who searched the whole way of knowledge, and gave it to Jacob his servant, and Israel his beloved, and after these things he appeared on earth, and dwelt among men. Again quoting the book of Baruch. And again, and concerning his incarnation, the same Jeremiah said, and he goes on quoting the book of Baruch. The Jews said, the things that you just said are not written in Jeremiah. The Christians said, they are in the epistle of Baruch. So again, Baruch is described as an epistle. The Jews said, this is so. The Christians said, but the epistle of Baruch and the lamentations of Jeremiah and his prophecy are generally designated as one book. So again, in this conversation between Timothy and Aquila, is the same thing what we find between Athanasius and Zacchaeus. That the Christian argues that all these are basically one book called Jeremiah. Now in these dialogues we do see a pushback from the Jew, who says that Baruch is not part of Jeremiah, but that's natural since these dialogues are coming from the 5th century. By the 5th century, that might be the case, that of course the Jews did not include the book of Baruch, naturally, so the Christians would reflect it in these dialogues. Again, and also it is written thus in Jeremiah, and he goes on quoting the book of the book of Baruch as coming from Jeremiah. And again, and Jeremiah the prophet will testify, and goes on quoting the book of Baruch. And now here comes the interesting thing. This is what Nicolas de Lange wrote in his book, Jewish Reception of Greek Bible Versions. In other places, the Jewish character is sometimes portrayed quoting from Deuterocanonical books. This is, for example, the case in dialogue between Regentius and Herban, where the Jewish character quotes from Baruch chapter 4 verse 4 under the name of Jeremiah. And same way, there are also other passages like in the Trophea Damasci, where the Jewish character quotes from Baruch chapter 3 verse 36. Also in the Doctrina Jacobi, Baruch is used unproblematically by Jacob, the pro-Christian Jewish character. But there is a reaction from Eustace when he uses the wisdom of Solomon or the Agraphon of Matthew. So interestingly, when the book of Baruch is quoted, there is no pushback from the Jewish opponent. But when he quotes the wisdom of Solomon, that's a problem, and now there is a pushback from the Jew. So this seems to reflect that the Jew actually accepted the book of Baruch but rejected the wisdom of Solomon, quite interestingly. Why didn't he offer a pushback when he was also quoting Baruch? All these cases are better explained by admitting that these authors were not aware of any problem with the book of Baruch. So it seems that in the diaspora, among the Jews, there still might have been some Jews who were still using the book of Baruch in those days when these dialogues were happening. So here is the passage Lange was talking about. Here you see Urban. Urban is the Jewish character, and is quoting basically the book of Baruch as coming from Jeremiah. Again, you can see this is in French. Le Juif, which means the Jew, is quoting Baruch chapter 3 verse 36. Here's the English translation. So the Jew is quoting Baruch as coming from the prophet. And again, book of Baruch, chapter 3, quoted by the Jew. Here is Jeremiah again, and goes on quoting Baruch. And here's the note from the author. The attribution of this passage from Baruch to Jeremiah is quite common, as the books of these two prophets are united in the Septuagint. And again, and Jeremiah says again, "This is our God, there will be no other counted besides him." And furthermore, after this he was seen up on earth and walked among men, quoting the famous Baruch chapter 3, verses 36 and 38. So as you can see, Baruch was heavily used, and it seems that really, at least in the early rabbinic period, it was also part of the Jewish scriptures. And again, as Jeremiah also says, again, Baruch quoted as coming from Jeremiah. So, what is the reason that these Christians believed that the book of Baruch was still among the Hebrew scriptures? Now, there are two interesting articles, one by Lee MacDonald in year 2020 called "Fluidity in the Early Formation of the Hebrew Bible," who argues that basically the Jewish canonization of the sacred scriptures was in multiple stages, and while it reached its final form universally among all Jews, it really took a lot of time. So this is what MacDonald says: "This is a misunderstanding of Judaism of the late Second Temple period. Various Jewish sects were still debating the scope of their scriptures well into the Middle Ages. The Karaites, like the Samaritans, chided rabbinic Jews over their use of the prophets and for having more scriptures than the law of Moses as their scriptural authority." So you had even Jews who had less scriptures than what today we find in Judaism. But on the other hand, we have Edrei and Mendels, who says that there were Jews also who accepted more. Simultaneously, the Western diaspora adopted a very different collection of literature, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, which was rejected by sages of the East. So he now argues that in the Western diaspora, the Jews still used the Deuterocanon and other various books, and the reason why is because the Western diaspora was using Greek, and now since they were using the Greek, they were not affected by the Mishnah, the Midrash, and the Talmud, because they were circulating in Hebrew. But the Western diaspora was not familiar with Hebrew, so they were really just Greek-speaking Jews. And since they didn't understand Hebrew, they were not affected by these later 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century documents of rabbinical Judaism, and therefore they did not alter their canon. They were still using a larger canon. So all these scholars affirm that there really wasn't a universal Jewish canon until much, much later, certainly not in the pre-Christian era or around the turn of the era, but not even in the 1st or 2nd century. Now, how about Baruch and the Jewish liturgy? There's an interesting article by Thackeray, who argued that the book of Baruch was actually used in the liturgy. It was chanted in the fast of the 9th of Ab. And here you can see the chart when on various Sabbaths, the book of Baruch, various passages from the book of Baruch were used and as liturgical book in the Jewish synagogues. You can read Thackeray's work online. It's very extensive work. I don't want to really consume a lot of time on this, but Thackeray quite convincingly argues that he believed that the Jews indeed used the Book of Baruch in Jewish worship. Here's also the scholarly work. This book is sent to Jerusalem, meaning Baruch's epistle, for a public confession in the house of the Lord on the day of the feast and the appointed days. The feast, without further specification, could be the feast par excellence, the Feast of Tabernacles. This is the interpretation of this verse held by Barthélemy. According to Baruch, chapter 1, verse 14, it is very likely that on this date, in the synagogues of the diaspora, the book of Baruch was read. Now he argues that later on, Palestine did not use the book of Baruch, only the diaspora, but actually diaspora reflects what also was used in Palestine in earlier ages. And we have also external evidences, such as from the apostolic constitutions, and we find in the apostolic constitutions that allegedly the Jews were reading the book of Baruch in the period when the apostolic constitutions were written, which is around the 4th, 5th century. So this is what we find in the constitutions. For even now, on the 10th day of the month Gorpieus, when the day mean the Jews, assemble together, they read the lamentations of Jeremiah, in which it is said, the Spirit before our face, Christ the Lord was taken in their destructions, and Baruch, in whom it is written, this is our God, no other shall be esteemed with him. He found out every way of knowledge, and showed it to Jacob his son, and Israel his beloved. Now, this part, or this section, is also found in the Didascalia, which is even earlier than the apostolic constitutions. And in the Didascalia, we don't find this passage from Baruch. But this is what Thackeray says. Again, if the statement in the constitution stood alone, we might perhaps dismiss it as untrustworthy. But we have another witness from the same region to the use of Baruch in Jewish worship. So, in other words, if this would be the only document that points to a Jewish liturgical use of the book of Baruch, then okay, we can dismiss it that it's irrelevant, because the text in the Didascalia is not confirming that Baruch was used in the synagogues, but we have other sources as well. So we have another external Christian source, as Thackeray says, evidence of a work ascribed to Ephraim Sirus. In this case, Baruch is not named, but a quotation is made from it, which the Jewish synagogue are represented as singing on a date shortly before Passover. This passage occurs in a Palm Sunday sermon or diatribe against the Jews, entitled A Sermon Against the Jews, delivered on the first of the week of Hosanna of the same our father, the holy Mar Ephraim the Syrian. So here you can read the passage for yourself if you want. So the Christians are claiming in Syria, which is very close to Palestine, right? So the Syria Christians actually are reporting that in this time, in the time of Ephraim the Syrian, the book of Baruch was used in liturgy in the Jewish synagogues. They were singing the book of Baruch. And so Adams also concludes, a general liturgical theory has much to recommend it, particularly as the text itself specifies that the book is to be read in a specific religious setting, and the overall narrative is framed in terms of corporate worship and repentance, with the installation of hope at the conclusion. So Adams actually confirms that Baruch, the book of Baruch, was actually a liturgical book that was used in the Jewish synagogue. And now let's look at our final part, supposed errors and contradictions in the book of Baruch. Now, this comes from a slide of a Protestant apologist who was, of course, trying to disseminate that there are lots of errors and contradictions in the Deuterocanon. And so, since this is about the book of Baruch, this presentation, then I decided to look at these contradictions, so-called contradictions, and I'm going to refute them. And I'm going to refute them in a way that I'm going to use only Jewish sources. But first, just let me tell you that this is very, very sad that Protestants have to argue like atheists. Okay? For me, this is just a confirmation that it is really difficult to defend the Protestant position when it comes to the canon. If you are really willing to use such tactics which are used by atheists against the Protestant Bibles as well, this shows that you really just have to use whatever you can to argue for a Protestant canon. And once again, I have to regret that this individual has to reach for such tactics which are used by atheists to show that his own Bible has contradictions. Now, of course, two more remarks. First, it's really easy to throw out contradictions. I mean, look, I don't believe that the individual who wrote this actually put the same effort to try to resolve these seeming contradictions. I certainly don't think he did his best. Okay, so now if you are going to use these tactics of the atheists, you should at least try, or at least give the benefit of doubt. Okay, so try to reconcile. Okay, is it really a contradiction? Did I do my best to resolve these supposed contradictions, just as he would do with his own Bible? And the second thing, I think there are much worse seemingly problematic passages, even in the Hebrew Bible or the Protestant canon, much worse than these are. But I still think that even if I would show him some and he would not be able to reconcile them, he would still not reject those books, because he already made his decision that he will accept the Bible as it is, and it doesn't matter whether there is a contradiction or not. So there's a double standard here. I do believe there is a double standard. I'm 100% sure he would not, say the Bible is in error or something, even if an atheist would point out such a grave or difficulty that he would not be able to reconcile. Okay, and it's even worse when you see debates between Protestant and Catholics, and the Protestant is just throwing out these supposed contradictions, and you see, gotcha, there's an error, so therefore the Deuterocanon is not inspired. I mean, first thing, you don't even have the time to address not even one, because sometimes you really need to dwell into a lot of information and unpack a lot of things layer by layer to show that there isn't really a contradiction. So really it's the worst tactic I can see from Protestants when in debates they are throwing out these supposed contradictions. And the other thing is, I mean, look, there is always a way to resolve contradictions. Okay, I would highly recommend watching Gary's videos on biblical inerrancy. I think he unpacked that very well. It's really just about what interpretation you will accept. I mean, ultimately, you can always say that, the autographs, the original writings that the author wrote, that is the one that is inerrant, or that is the one that doesn't contain any alterations in the text. So everything but comes later doesn't matter if there's any supposed contradiction, but because it really isn't a contradiction. So there, just as it's easy to throw out contradictions, it's really even easy to reconcile them, because it's really just about what explanation you are willing to accept and what not. Okay, so that is all about. But these ones about Book of Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah are, I mean, these aren't really contradictions. Clearly, the person who thinks that these are contradictions didn't even try to look into his own Bible, whether these are really contradictions. Now I'm going to show why. So there are three supposed contradictions. The first one is that in the book of Baruch, you can read that Baruch is writing in Babylon, while in the book of Jeremiah, Baruch is writing in Judah and later enters Egypt with Jeremiah, but he's not in Babylon. So there's a seeming contradiction. The second contradiction is that Baruch allegedly claims that he is writing in Babylon in the fifth year of burning of in the fifth year of Nebuchadnezzar, when the temple was burned. While in 2 Kings and Jeremiah 52, we read that the temple was burnt in the 19th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So, 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar versus 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar. And lastly, there's a supposed contradiction in the Epistle of Jeremiah, where the epistle says that the Jews will be in Babylon for 7 generations, which the person equates with 210 years or something like that, because he argues that the word genea, coming from the Greek, means generation, that it means necessarily 30 to 33 years. I don't know, I didn't find anything about this that it must mean only this, but okay. And while Jeremiah and Chronicles says that Jews will be in Babylon for 70 years, so 200 and something versus 70. So to break down this very easily, so the first contradiction is that Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, according to the book of Jeremiah and 2 Kings, while according to the book of Baruch, it was in the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The second contradiction is that Baruch was in Judah, and that's the place where he wrote something and later entered Egypt, while the book of Baruch claims that Baruch is writing in Babylon, so a different place. And the third contradiction is that according to Jeremiah and 2 Chronicles, the Jews were in Babylon for 70 years, but according to the book of Baruch, chapter 6 or letter of Jeremiah, they were in Babylon for 7 generations. So let's look at the first one. Just a second. So let's look at the first contradiction. So, was the temple destroyed in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar or the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar? Now, this is very funny because actually when you read the book of Baruch, it doesn't say it's the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar. So the person who says that there's a contradiction, he is reading Nebuchadnezzar into the text, because the text is not saying anything about Nebuchadnezzar in this particular passage. So this is the passage from the book of Baruch. These are the words of the book of Baruch. These are the words of the book that Baruch, son of Neriah, son of Messiah, son of Zedekiah, and son of Hasadiah, and son of Hilkiah, wrote in Babylon in the 5th year, on the 7th day of the month, at the time when the Chaldeans took Jerusalem and burned it with fire. So as you can see, it doesn't say in the 5th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, it doesn't even specify. Almost, it seems to be that it doesn't even specify the 5th year of like what, you know. Usually, when you read something and it tries to relate the date to some event. Now, the only event we have here is that at the time Chaldeans took Jerusalem and burned it, but it doesn't say the 5th year of, you know, when the temple was burned. It rather seems to be that it's 5th year after the Chaldeans took Jerusalem and burned it. But let's look at some scholars, what they say. This is Thackeray. The date is extraordinarily vague. The starting point from which the 5th year is reckoned is not stated. The month is not named, though the day of the month is. The capture and burning of Jerusalem appear to be regarded as contemporaneous, though actually separated by an interval of 3 weeks. The reference to the burning on the 7th day of the month can, however, only refer to the 5th month of Ab, on the 7th of which, according to the account in Kings, the conflagration took place. The words "in the 5th month" have possibly dropped out after "in the 5th year." So Thackeray says that this is related to what we found in the Book of Kings. So the Book of Kings says that on the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But if it's from the Book of Kings, then it says in the 19th year, so that would be correct. But speaking about contradictions, look at this. 2 Kings says that it was on the 7th day when the temple was destroyed. However, Jeremiah chapter 52 says on the 10th day of the 5th month in the 19th year. So I'm curious whether the person who is throwing out these contradictions is aware of this, because now we have two passages. One says it's the 7th day and one says from the 10th day. So, okay, now we can, as I said, it's very easy to throw out contradictions, like many from the Bible. Here's more. He says, the unnamed Greek text, which all the Asian versions follow, is very vague and inevitably raises several questions. The 5th year of what? So again, more also acknowledges that this passage in Baruch is vague. It doesn't really record or doesn't really say that 5th year of what. And again, the 7th day of what month? But afterwards, he says this. Baruch would have written his letter then in 581 BC, 5 years to the day after those terrible events. So Moore says that the possibility is that when he says 5th year, he means 5 years after the conflagration of the temple. Because I think that's the most natural way of reading the text of Baruch, when it says in the 5th year, when the Chaldeans took Jerusalem. So the author of the book of Baruch wants to say that 5 years elapsed since the Chaldeans took Jerusalem, right? Now, if it's the 5th year after they took Jerusalem, that would be the 23rd year. If it's 5 years after they burned it with fire, it's the 24th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Because Jerusalem was taken in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and temple was destroyed in the 19th year. So 18 plus 5 is 23. 19 plus 5 is 24. Here's Dote and Fine. Baruch is the title given by all the Greek manuscripts. Few biblical characters, apart from the secretary of the prophet Jeremiah, bear the Hebrew name Baruch, meaning blessed, the passive participle of the verb Barak. The historical setting outlined in the first verses of the book is that of the exile 5 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So here in this scholarly work, the authors argue that Baruch is saying that it's 5th year after the fall of Jerusalem, and that would be the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And that's what I also agree. Because when you look at when was Jerusalem taken, in Jeremiah chapter 32, we read that it was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar when the army of the king of Babylon was besieging Jerusalem. And in Jeremiah 52, we also read that it was Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year when the people were taken from Jerusalem. In other words, in his 18th year, Jerusalem was taken and people were deported. So, but we also read that it was the 19th year when the temple was burned, and this is from Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings. So taking Jerusalem and burning it are two separate years. So again, let's go back to the text of Baruch. In the 5th year, on the 7th day of the month, at the time when the Chaldeans took Jerusalem and burned it with fire. So if the 5th year is related to taking, then it would be 5 years after the taking, and that would mean that it's Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year, or burning the temple, and that would be 24th year. Now, as I said, I'm going to use Jewish sources. So let's look what Josephus has to say about it. These accounts agree, and this comes from Megan Stapien, by the way. These accounts agree with the true histories in our books. So he's talking about histories of the Jewish books. For in them it is written that Nebuchadnezzar, in the 18th year of his reign, laid our temple desolate. Which is interesting because Jeremiah and 2 Kings says that the temple was burnt in the 19th year, but here Josephus apparently joins the both events, taking Jerusalem and burning the temple, into one event, and therefore he says that it's the 18th year. This is what Tyson said. Although the text of Jeremiah does not say that the 18th year was when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, it seems to imply this when it states that the people deported in that year were from Jerusalem. Further, in Against Apian, Josephus refers explicitly to the 18th year as the year that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, and adds that this information comes from our books. But if you want to be nitpicking with years, here's another problem. When did the first deportation from Jerusalem occur? Was it the 7th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, as we read in Jeremiah 52, when 3,000 Jews were carried to exile? Or was it the 8th year, as we read in 2 Kings, where it says that he carried all Jerusalem into exile? So, again, as I said, it's very easy to throw out apparent contradictions from the Bible. So, there really isn't any contradiction in regards to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, because in the worst case, it really doesn't say that it's the 5th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. The person deliberately read this into the text, while it doesn't say it's the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar. And it really seems, even according to Josephus, that it's the 5th year after the Babylonians burnt the temple or took Jerusalem. Now let's look at the so-called second contradiction. So according to Jeremiah and 2 Kings, Baruch wrote while he was in Judea and later entered Egypt, while in the book of Baruch we read that Baruch wrote in Babylon. So was it in Babylon? Was it in Judea? Why is he in Babylon if he wasn't in Babylon? So this seems to be a contradiction, right? Okay, let's look into this. Now, what I just want to say that there is only a contradiction if there is no possibility or no way that after Egypt, Baruch would go to Babylon. So you can speak about contradiction only if you can exclude for 100% the possibility that Baruch was either taken to Babylon from Egypt or he himself went to Babylon from Egypt. Okay, so you need to exclude this possibility. If you cannot exclude this possibility, there is no contradiction. But even the book of Jeremiah hints to the fact that actually Jews were deported from Egypt to Babylon, and that would imply that even Baruch could have been taken from Egypt to Babylon. So this is what Jeremiah chapter 43 says. They also led away all those whom Nebuchadnezzar, commander of the imperial guard, had left with Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, the men, the women, the children, and the king's daughters. And they took Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch, son of Neriah, along with them. So they entered Egypt in disobedience to the Lord and went as far as Taphnes. So this is chapter 43, and it says that Jeremiah and Baruch entered into Egypt, specifically into this place. This is very important, okay? Now later on, this is what we read in verse 11. He will come, this is what Jeremiah is prophesying, he will come and attack Egypt, bringing death to those destined for death, captivity to those destined for captivity, and the sword to those destined to the sword. So Jeremiah is prophesying about Nebuchadnezzar coming into Egypt, and of course Jeremiah is prophesying here in Egypt, but specifically in this place, and he's saying that Nebuchadnezzar will come and deport some more people into Babylon. And look at this, in chapter 44, Jeremiah is prophesying. He says, this word came to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews living in Lower Egypt, and he mentions the specific place where Jeremiah and Baruch went. Okay? Now, if we just go with the book of Jeremiah, we already have predictions and prophecies that Nebuchadnezzar will conquer Egypt and he will take the Jews. Some he will, of course, slay, as he says, some are destined to death, but some are destined to captivity. And again, I promised to be using Jewish sources. So let's look at Josephus and his Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 10, verse 179. Accordingly, both the people and Yohanan disobeyed the counsel of God which he gave them by the prophet, and removed into Egypt and carried Jeremiah and Baruch along with him. So we have the passage about Jeremiah and Baruch entering Egypt. And now look at this. Later on, just after this, this is what Josephus says. And when they were there, meaning in Egypt, God signified to the prophet that the king of Babylon was about making an expedition against the Egyptians and commanded him to foretell to the people that Egypt should be taken, and the king of Babylon should slay some of them and should take others captive and bring them to Babylon, which things came to pass accordingly, for on the 5th year after the destruction of Jerusalem, which was the 23rd of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he made an expedition against Celesyria, and when he possessed himself of it, he made war against the Ammonites and Moabites, and when he had brought all these nations under subjection, he fell upon Egypt in order to overthrow it, and he slew the king that then reigned and set up another, and he took those Jews that were their captives and led them away to Babylon. So actually, Josephus is confirming that Nebuchadnezzar came to Egypt and took all those Jews who were there in Egypt and took them where? To Babylon. So now we have a clear possibility that Baruch was taken from Egypt to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar when? 5 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. That is what Baruch is talking about, right? That's coherent. Now, Jeremiah chapter 52 is actually summarizing all 3 deportations. This is what Jeremiah 52 says. This is the number of the people Nebuchadnezzar carried into exile. In the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 30,000 Jews. Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, 832 people from Jerusalem. In the 23rd year, 745 Jews taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the imperial guard. So there were 4,600 people in all. So here are the places of deportations. So the first deportation is from Jerusalem. Then we have the 18th year, right? Taking Jerusalem and besieging it and destroying the temple, and also taking 832 people from Jerusalem. But the last deportation, the third one, in his 23rd year, is not from Jerusalem, but it's from Egypt, and from the very place where Baruch and Jeremiah entered. So actually, it seems that Baruch was indeed deported to Babylon, but not from Jerusalem, but from Egypt. So he was in Judea, later he entered Egypt, and later he was carried away to Babylon. So there were 3 campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar, and here are the years that are related to his reign. So the first campaign was either in the 7th year or the 8th year, depending whether you are going with Jeremiah 52 or 2 Kings, I don't know. Then we have taking Jerusalem, carrying away the people, and burning the temple. Now the question is, burning the temple was on the 7th day or the 10th day. And then we have the third deportation from Egypt. And let's now compare Josephus, Jeremiah, and the book of Baruch. So Josephus says that, for on the 5th year after the destruction of Jerusalem, which was the 23rd of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So that matches with what we find in Jeremiah, because it was Nebuchadnezzar 18th year when Jerusalem was taken, and the last deportation is exactly 5 years after taking Jerusalem, right? So this matches what Josephus says, and this matches what Baruch says, that it's the 5th year when Baruch is writing his epistle to the Jews in Jerusalem. The 5th year of what? 5th year after taking Jerusalem. So actually all these sources are consistent and match each other. Now I looked into Etienne Nodet, who wrote this magnificent book, who really dissects Josephus in small details. And this is what he says. As for Baruch, Josephus probably was aware of his presence in Babylonia instead of Egypt, using Baruch chapter 1. Interesting. And also look at this. Jeremiah's oracle was not to go to Egypt, but the people replied, Baruch is inciting you against us in order to be taken by the Chaldeans. Josephus renders, to please Baruch he was belying God. According to verse 6, Yohanan took all the people left after the third campaign, and the story and the death of Gedaliah, including Jeremiah and Baruch, and went into Egypt. Then comes a lengthy prophecy of Jeremiah, who announces that the king of Egypt will be defeated, but no further deportation of Judeans is mentioned. However, Josephus reports this campaign, then joins the deportations and gives it a twofold dating, the 5th year of the fall of Jerusalem, that is the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, he introduces here the third campaign of the summary of Jeremiah 52 with Nabuzaradan, contrarily to verse 6. And now notice this. He may have been prompted to such manipulation by Baruch, chapter 1, on the 5th year. Baruch, who was in Babylon, wrote a book and read it before King Jeconiah. So actually, Etienne Nodet says that from what we read from Josephus, it seems clear that he used the book of Baruch because he was manipulated to talk about this third deportation again. So, and he's mentioning the 5th year and the 23rd year. So the reason why he's mentioning the 5th year is probably because he is using the book of Baruch. And this is what is confirmed again in this scholarly book. But according to Flavius Josephus, in chapter 10, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Baruch, after the conquest of Egypt by the Babylonians, was transported with Jeremiah to Babylon. So, actually, there is no contradiction. Baruch being in Babylon, that is actually coherent with what we see in Jeremiah's predictions and in what we see in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. But there's even more. There's a 2nd century Jewish work, a rabbinical work, called Seder Olam Rabbah. Seder Olam Rabbah is a 2nd century chronicle that details the dates of biblical events, notice that biblical events, from creation to Alexander the Great's conquest of the ancient Near East. It adds no stories beyond what is in the biblical text. This is very familiar with what Josephus is doing, right? So he adds nothing, he takes out nothing, he just rewrites what the Bible says, what the Hebrew scripture says. So this is Seder Olam Rabbah, 2nd century rabbinical text. Now, interestingly enough, in Seder Olam Rabbah, chapter 26, we read that, and Jeremiah and Baruch were exiled to Babylon. But if you don't have the book of Baruch, you actually don't know that Baruch was deported into Babylon. You only know that Baruch was deported into Babylon if you have the book of Baruch. So the compilers, the 2nd century Jewish compilers of Seder Olam Rabbah, probably, and that's consistent with Aquila and Theodotion, had the book of Baruch among their sacred scriptures, because Seder Olam Rabbah is nothing else than a chronicle of dates of biblical events, and it adds no stories beyond what is in the biblical texts. So this is just another confirmation that in the 2nd century the Jews still had the book of Baruch. Moreover, in chapter 20, this is what we read in Seder Olam Rabbah. They prophesied close to the destruction. Baruch, son of Neriah. So Baruch was actually prophesying. He wasn't just a mere scribe of Jeremiah, but even Baruch, he himself prophesied. Now, we also have a 3rd century Jewish text. It's called the Sifra on the Book of Numbers, which is a midrash. And as you can see, it was compiled around the 3rd century in Israel. And this is what we read in Sifra Bamidbar, chapter 78. 8 prophets issued from Rachav Hazonah. And he lists the 8 prophets, and one of them is Baruch. Interesting. So he's not just a scribe, but he's also a prophet. Now, what about the Talmud? This comes from the Jerusalem Talmud in Sanhedrin, chapter 1. Jeremiah intercalated outside the land, Ezekiel intercalated outside the land, Baruch ben Neriah intercalated outside the land. Now, what does this mean, intercalated outside the land? Ginsburg, one of the foremost scholars on Judaism, writes this. The Jerusalem Talmud Sanhedrin and the parallel passages on margin where it is stated that Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Baruch fixed the calendar outside the Holy Land, as the context shows, this can only refer to Babylon. So, according to this, Baruch was in Babylon, according to the Jerusalem Talmud. What about other sources? We have Midrash on Song of Songs, or Shir HaShirim Rabbah, and this comes from chapter 5. Why did Ezra not ascend at that time? It was because he needed to clarify his studies before Baruch ben Neriah. So let Baruch ben Neriah ascend. Rather, they said, Baruch ben Neriah was a large, elderly man, and he could not even be loaded onto a sedan chair. So actually, Ezra was a student of Baruch, but Ezra was in Babylon, right? So this means that Baruch was in Babylon. And this is what Feldman, one of the foremost scholars on Josephus, this is what Feldman says. In the rabbinic tradition, Ezra is depicted as a great scholar who was still studying in Babylonia under Baruch ben Neriah, the scribe of the prophet Jeremiah, when Daniel and his companions left for Palestine. So this just confirms that Baruch was indeed in Babylon. So there is no contradiction in the book of Baruch describing him writing a book in Babylon. Now the Babylonian Talmud, Megillah 16a, Rav said, and some say that Rav Shmuel Bar Marta said, studying Torah is greater and more important than building the temple. A proof of this is that for as long as Baruch ben Neriah was alive in Babylon, Ezra, who was his disciple, did not leave him and go up to Eretz Israel to build a temple. So again, the Talmud is saying that Ezra was a student of Baruch who was in Babylon. Moreover, the very same Megillah describes the 8 prophets again, and he counts among these prophets also Baruch, the son of Neriah, and also Jeremiah. So Baruch is a prophet just as Jeremiah. They're on the same level. Baruch is not just a mere scribe, but he's also a prophet just as Jeremiah. we have also Talmud Megillah 15a. The Gemara raises an objection from the following Berida. Now, Protestants will appeal to Berida, which is an oral tradition of the Jews, when they try to show you that their canon matches the rabbinic canon. But actually, Berida says also this. Baruch, the son of Neriah, and others who are listed here, you can see also Daniel and Mordecai and others, and Zechariah and Malachi, all prophesied in the second year of Darius. So all these prophets, including Baruch the son of Neriah, who is the same prophet as Zechariah or Malachi, they all prophesied. And this is what Adam says. There are also several other references to describe Baruch in Jewish writings. For instance, in the Megillah, discusses the relationship between Baruch and Ezra, claiming that Ezra would not leave Baruch to go to the land of Israel while Baruch was still alive. Prior to this, Megillah calls Baruch a prophet. Interesting. So we have multiple rabbinical texts, ancient rabbinical texts, as ancient as 2nd century, which is one of the earliest, because the earliest rabbinical texts do come from the 2nd century, which is the Seder Olam and the Mishnah. And as we could see, the Seder Olam calls Baruch specifically as a prophet. He's prophesying and he's in Babylon. But then we have other legends from the Jews, and these legends were compiled by none other than Louis Ginsberg. And one whole chapter is dedicated to Baruch. And this is what we can read in the legends of the Jews. At first, his mourning over the misfortunes of Jerusalem and the people knew no bounds. But he was in a measure consoled at the end of a 7 days fast, when God made known to him that the day of reckoning would come for the heathen too. Other divine visions, notice these divine visions, were vouchsafed him. The whole future of mankind was unrolled before his eyes, especially the history of Israel, and he learned that the coming of the Messiah would put an end to all sorrow and misery and usher in the reign of peace and joy among men. But where do we read such things from Baruch? We certainly don't read these in Jeremiah, but we read these in his own epistle, the epistle of Baruch, that the Messiah will walk among men and will converse with men. And look at this. The consoled Baruch addressed an admonition to the people left in Palestine and wrote 2 letters of the same tenor to the exiles, one to the 9 tribes and a half, the other to the 2 tribes and a half. The letter to the 9 tribes and a half of the captivity was carried to them by an eagle. 5 years after the great catastrophe, he composed a book in Babylonia, which contained penitential prayers and hymns of consolation, exhorting Israel and urging the people to return to God and his law. Baruch sent his book also to the residents of Jerusalem, and they read it in the temple on distinguished days and recited the prayers it contains. So notice this. These legends just confirm that Baruch was writing his epistle, his own epistle, 5 years after the destruction. So this is what Baruch chapter 1 is about, right? And clearly the description matches what the book of Baruch is about. It's about penitential prayers, and these prayers are read in the temple on distinguished days. So it's used in Jewish worship. Interestingly, there are also, in the legends, we read that Baruch died in Babylon and he was buried there. And there's a legend about an Arab who wanted to visit the tomb of Ezekiel, but the tomb of Ezekiel is next to the tomb of Baruch. And so this prince, this Arabic prince, wanted to visit or was advised to visit both. And it's also said that an old Arab advised the prince to call upon the Jews to gain entrance for him, seeing that Baruch had been a Jew and his books were still being studied by Jews. So these legends just confirm that the Jews were still using the book of Baruch. Even in the Encyclopedia Iranica, which has nothing to do with the Jews, says this: since he accompanied, meaning Baruch, Jeremiah in his exile to Babylonia, a medieval Jewish tradition placed his tomb on the Euphrates, not far from the tomb of the prophet Ezekiel. These tombs served as centers for Jewish pilgrimage from Iraq and Iran in the Middle Ages, and there were reports of various miracles produced at Baruch's tomb. So this means, again, just Baruch was indeed in Babylon. He wrote his book in Babylon, and he ultimately died in Babylon. But before that, he was prophesying. So we resolved two contradictions, or alleged contradictions. Now let's look at the third one, which is related to the Epistle of Jeremiah. So the book of Jeremiah and 2nd Chronicles says that the Jews were in Babylon for 70 years, while the Epistle of Jeremiah says for 7 generations. So now Jeremiah 29 says, "This is what the Lord says: when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place." 2nd Chronicles chapter 36. Now the person has 26. I think that's a typo, but nevertheless. So 2nd Chronicles 36 verse 21 says, "The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah." Now, this only says that the land is resting for 70 years. It's not talking about Jews being in Babylon. It's not saying how many years the Jews will be in Babylon. It only says that the land, Judea, will rest for 70 years. Now, what does it mean? Let's look at Daniel. In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So Daniel is interpreting now the words of Jeremiah, and he's given these visions, and from these visions he learned that Jeremiah was talking about desolation of Jerusalem. Okay, the land will be desolated for 70 years. This is not about how many years the Jews will be in Babylonia. In Jeremiah 25 we read, this whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So again, desolate wasteland. But if one wants to argue that the 70 years means or is related to the Jews being in Babylon, then it seems that then Jeremiah is contradicting himself, because actually, when do you start counting the 70 years? Now we have 3 deportations taking place, 2 from Jerusalem, one from Egypt, all appearing in different time periods. So we have, for instance, the difference between the first and the second deportation is 10 to 11 years, and the difference between the first and the third is 15 to 16 years. Now that's quite a difference. If we have 70 years, now 16 years makes quite a huge difference. So where do you start counting the 70 years? With the first deportation, or with the second deportation, or the third deportation? And when do you end the 70 years? Will it be the first return from the exile, when Cyrus made his edict in 536 BC? when around 50,000 Jews return, or later, because Ezra and Nehemiah returned in the 5th century. Indeed, scholars, like, there's a consensus that the return from the exile happened in several stages. This one, the 50,000 Jews, that's just the first stage. You have multiple stages. So when Ezra is coming back to Judea, actually, Jews are already there, right? And Nehemiah comes afterwards. So when do you start counting the 70 years, and when do you end counting the 70 years? Because it seems to me very arbitrary if you want to argue that it was 70 years. Clearly, it was more years when the Jews were in Babylon. Ultimately, that's more than a century. Now, let's go to the Epistle of Jeremiah, right? So, this Epistle of Jeremiah says 7 generations. The Jews will be there for 7 generations. This is what Moore says. Some scholars have explained the sharp disagreement between the Epistle and the canonical Jeremiah resulting from an early confusion in the Epistle over the alphabetic equivalents for certain numbers. That is, a 7 was read instead of a 3 in either the Hebrew stage or the Greek. So that's one possibility how we can resolve the problem. The other thing is that we don't really know what the author meant by generation. So the person who is insisting that there is a contradiction, he asserts that the word genea means 30 to 30 years, but actually there is nothing such. The word genea can mean virtually anything. There is no strict sense of genea to be equal to 30 to 30 years. I didn't find anything that it has to be the only meaning. Moreover, this is what Moore says, predicting future events in even the vaguest terms is, however, always fraught with perils, as evidenced by the fact that the writer of Daniel felt compelled to change Jeremiah's 70 years to 70 weeks of years, i.e. 490 years. So again, you can interpret various words and passages in various ways. Now, the word genea has many more meanings. For example, typical is the word genea in Mark chapter 13, verse 30, right? So when Jesus is talking about this generation, and now we know that the Gospel of Mark was written in Greek, so he's using the Greek word genea. For example, this scholar, Adam Bean, was trying to propose a new meaning. As a means of addressing these difficulties, the study, like many before it, reconsiders the meaning of genea in Mark chapter 13, verse 30. Unlike previous studies, the study considers the generation concept within eschatological expectations of Second Temple Judaism. So, as I said, like, you can interpret generations in many ways, and you can view different years under the word generation. Now, how about the most natural way of interpreting the word genea or generation? A biological way of interpreting the word generation. A generation is defined as all of the people born and living at about the same time, regarded collectively. This is one way. Or it can also be described as the average period generally considered to be about 20 to 30 years, during which children are born and grow up, become adults, and begin to have children. And this is also argued in Amram Trooper, who says that the average year of the people marrying was 20 to 30, approximately. Now, certainly, a 20-year-old woman can bear a child. the woman is mature enough in the 20s to bear a child, so giving a birth to a new generation. I would argue even younger. So in your mid-teen age or later teenage, a woman is capable of bearing a child. So if we take, for example, the 20 years, and if we multiply with 7, that would be 140 years. But even the letter of Jeremiah is not saying that it will be precisely 7 generations. It says only until 7 generations, or up to, or even to 7 generations. So it's an approximate. It gives you the maximum. It's not telling you the entire or total period until which the Jews will be in Babylon. So it can be a little bit less as well. But as I promised, I'm going to use Jewish sources. So this is what Josephus says in the Antiquities. Now as to Shalmaneser, he removed the Israelites out of their country and placed therein the nation of the Kuthians, who had formerly belonged to the inner parts of Persia and Media, but were then called Samaritans, by taking the name of the country to which they were removed. But the king of Babylon, who brought out the 2 tribes, placed no other nation in their country, by which means all Judea and Jerusalem and the temple continued to be desert for 70 years. But the entire interval of time which passed from the captivity of the Israelites to the carrying away of the 2 tribes proved to be 130 years, 6 months, and 10 days. Now notice, Josephus clearly describes the 70 years as the time when the temple and Judea continued to be deserted. That is what the 70 years are related to. It's not about how many years the Jews will be in Babylon. But when it comes to the time, the total time of the captivity of the Israelites, that's 130 years, 6 months, and 10 days. So Josephus clearly is making a distinction between the 70 years, which relates only to the desolation of the land, and the total time that elapsed during the captivity. So Josephus says 130 years, 6 months, and 8 days. The letter of Jeremiah says 7 generations. So I said, in your 20s, you're perfectly capable of giving birth to a child. So now we have a new generation. And if we multiply by 7, that's 140 years. Now the 7th generation would be approximately between 120 years and 140 years if we take a generation as 20 years. And that's perfectly coherent with what Josephus says. And again, the letter of Jeremiah is not giving you the exact date, it's just giving you the maximum. So it says up to 7 generations. So that's consistent with Josephus. And actually, I would argue that Josephus is using the letter of Jeremiah even to prove his point that the Jews were in Babylon for much longer than 70 years. So none of these passages, these alleged contradictions, are actually contradictions. And as I said, I wanted to use specifically Jewish sources, Josephus, early rabbinic documents like the Seder Oram from the 2nd century, and also later documents like the Midrash, the Talmud, and all these sources refute the idea that Baruch or letter of Jeremiah are contradicting other scriptures. With that said, I want to cite Roger Beckwith now, who actually concedes that there's huge evidence that actually the book of Baruch was viewed as sacred scripture among the Pharisees. Of course, Roger Beckwith tries to use language where he tries to downgrade this these evidence, and so he's very careful how he used the words and with the wordings. Nevertheless, he says that yeah, it's a vital possibility that the book of Baruch was in the canon of the Pharisees. So this is what he says on page 101 and footnote 90. Baruch is the only other book which was perhaps regarded as canonical by a few Pharisees. So notice this, perhaps by a few. So as I said, I think Beckwith really feels the burden, right? The burden of the load of arguments and the evidence that points to the book of Baruch being a canonical book for the Pharisees. But he tries to, use very careful wording not to attract much attention to this. So he tries to downgrade this. He says a few Pharisees, on page, but he says this repeatedly. Look at this, page 342. These 9 considerations enable us to see with some precision what is involved in the 6 questions which we pose on page 338. As to the scope of the Pharisaic canon, the Apocrypha, which may conceivably have been added to the canon among the Palestinian Pharisees, are only Ecclesiasticus and Baruch. However, even among those books of the Apocrypha which were composed in Hebrew or Aramaic, the only ones which there is slightest evidence to suggest were reckoned canonical by any of the Palestinian Pharisees are Ecclesiasticus and Baruch. Now notice that he acknowledges that these are the Palestinian Pharisees, so, right, the Kagir recension and Aquila, these are all Palestinians. But again, look at the careful wording of Beckwith, right? So, slightest evidence, or then he says, which may conceivably have been added to the canon, and so on and so forth. So he's very careful with the wording, but I think he acknowledges the huge load of the evidence pointing to Baruch being canonical. And again, in page 376, as was pointed out on page 90 and note, the only books outside the Hebrew Bible of which there is any evidence at all that the Pharisees may have reckoned them canonical are Ecclesiasticus and Baruch. And again, on page 504, footnote 53, the attribution of a quasi-canonicity to Baruch seems not to have been unknown among the Jews, but the book was not widely accepted. So each time Baruch, Beckwith is addressing the book of Baruch as being among the canonical scriptures, he is very careful with the wording. He says quasi-canonicity. It was not widely accepted, perhaps by a few, where it's very funny to me because he mentions book of Baruch as a very good adapt of being in the Pharisaic canon. He mentions it several times, but he's always very careful. Now, of course, I agree with him that Ecclesiasticus, which is Sirach, was certainly viewed as canonical. Sirach was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and in Masada, in fragments which predate the turn of the era and are written in a special format reserved for biblical books, as Immanuel Toh says, the foremost scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's certainly mentioned numerous times in the Talmud and rabbinic sources. And the funny thing is with Beckwith, even Beckwith is quite cherry picking, When it comes to Baruch, he will say, maybe a few Jews and so on and so forth, or same way with Sirach. But when it comes proving that a book that he himself accepts, like the book of Ecclesiasticus, he tries to argue from 1-2 Talmudic sources from the 5th century that, well, it was certainly accepted even before Shammai and Hillel were debating it. Okay, and I want to show you how inconsistent Roger Beckwith is and how he's cherry picking from the data. So here you can see, this is from page 300. Baba Batra, we have a conversation between Herod the Great and Baba Ben Butta, in which the latter argues from Ecclesiastes, employing a conventional formula for quoting scripture, for it is written. Now, Baba Ben Butta was an early disciple of Shammai, so this tradition could date from before Bet Shammai denied the inspiration of Ecclesiastes, and could indicate that Shammai himself accepted it. So I already addressed this in my third part regarding the book of Esdras. I showed that it's probably more, it's rather Baba Ben Butta who flip-flopped and sided with Bet Hillel. And it's not Shammai who was originally accepting Ecclesiastes and later the school of Shammai rejecting it. That's nonsense, I think. So I addressed this, but there's another argument. It comes from the Jerusalem Talmud, and this is what Beckwith says. Similarly, in Jerusalem Talmud Berakot 7.2, Simeon ben Sheta is represented as quoting Ecclesiastes as scripture, again using Ketib or it is written. Simeon ben Sheta was teaching 2 generations before Shammai and Hillel, so if this tradition is genuine, it goes far towards proving that the view of Bet Hillel was the older view. Both passages have a Haggadic character, and the sayings they contain may not be authentic, but they at least show that the rabbis who formulated these traditions had no suspicion that the view of Bet Shammai was the older, or probably that it was shared by Shammai himself. So Beckwith is arguing that, it's true that we see a disputation between the school of Shammai and school of Hillel, but probably Shammai himself did not reject the book of Ecclesiastes, and moreover we have this figure, Simeon ben Sheta, who lived even before Shammai, and he is quoting the book of Ecclesiastes as it is written, therefore Ecclesiastes was accepted well before Shammai and Hillel have even lived. So here is the passage from the Jerusalem Talmud, Berakot 7.2, where indeed Simeon ben Sheta is quoting Ecclesiastes with the formula as it is written. And Simeon ben Sheta lived around 140 to 60 BCE. So Beckwith's argument is that since Ecclesiastes is cited with the introductory formula, it is written, it shows that it was used as scripture. Now, there are 2 problems here. First, even Beckwith at least acknowledges, and I have to stress this, that he acknowledges that these traditions may not be authentic. Yes, these were written around the 5th century. I mean, good, Beckwith. I really have to tip my hat. The other problem is that Jerusalem Talmud Berakot chapter 7 is a little bit longer than this. And if we continue on, we will see that this is what Simeon ben Sheta says. Knowledge is an advantage, wisdom lets its possessor alive. He said to him, why did you sit between king and the queen? And he said, meaning Simeon ben Sheta, he said to him, it is written in the book of Ben Sirah, esteem it and it will raise you and set you between princes. So the king is asking him questions, and Simeon ben Sheta is answering from passages from Ecclesiastes Then we have something from Isaiah. And then we have Ben Sira, which is Ecclesiasticus, which is not accepted by the Jews. And he is introducing it with the formula, it is written. Of course, Beckwith is not going to tell you this, but too bad for him. I looked the primary passage and Beckwith proved too much. So if he wants to argue that this proves that Ecclesiastes was accepted before Shammai, then also Ben Sira was accepted before Shammai. So the Jews originally accepted Ben Sira before the turn of the era. Congratulations, Roger Beckwith. So to summarize, I think the evidence is overwhelming. Both the Septuagint and the Kaige recension confirm a pre-Christian book of Jeremiah that included the book of Baruch. And even the 2nd century translators, such as Theodotion and Aquila, who were proselytes, also included passages from the book of Baruch. And you cannot argue just simply, okay, but it doesn't matter. It's just they just included it, but they didn't really view it as scripture. That's a nonsense, because why on earth would they include a book that they did not, if they wanted to bring the Greek more in line with the Hebrew scriptures, with the pre-Masoretic text, especially if the Christians were heavily using the book of Baruch to prove the deity of Christ. Christians repeatedly inform us that the Jews have Baruch among their scriptures and in their liturgy as well. Josephus draws information from the book of Baruch, and I would argue from the letter of Jeremiah. And in the rabbinic literature, Baruch is a prophet. He's prophesying, and he's prophesying in Babylon. So clearly, I think the book of Baruch, it has such a great attestation. It has great attestation among the church fathers, in the ecumenical councils, and even in Jewish sources, and even in Jewish pre-Christian sources. So thank you for watching. I hope you like it. Please like, share, leave a comment, and don't forget to support the channel. Please support Gary on Patreon and also William on Patreon, and check out Gary's Substack as well. He's got very good articles there. So God bless everyone. Bye bye.